I finished reading this the other day, not today, but the other day actually, a couple of days ago already. It's the second book of the senior year adventures from the Percy Jackson series, Wrath of the Triple Goddess. For the longest time, I thought it was Triple Goddesses because triple and goddesses is. I assumed it would be plural, and it had only occurred to me after finishing reading the book, that there are only two S's in the title word. But yeah, I finally finished it, and I'm so happy to have finished reading a whole fiction book once again. I think the last piece of fiction that I have finished reading before this was a short story that I found on one random night, and I wanted to reflect on philosophy of fiction. And then the one before that would have been the another short story from the Percy Jackson series, and then maybe the sixth book. I mean the first book for the senior year adventures. I actually got this book a few days after it was released here in the country, but I only got to read it the other day. I only got to finish reading it the other day. Well, open it the other day. After buying it, I bought it after I think I finished writing one article, and I thought, okay, I think I deserve a treat of a book. So I bought this. I was so excited. It was the weekend when I bought it, and yet after buying it, I put it on the desk, and I don't know what happened. I didn't get to read it that weekend, and again the week after that, I didn't get to read it. Week after that, I didn't get to read it. I think that was a good couple of months ago. As December was ending, I just found it so hilarious that there'd been this long stretch that I couldn't even open the book or start reading it. And it's not as though it's a difficult book. It's Percy Jackson. It's fun. It's light. It's easy, but I couldn't get myself to start reading it. It's partly because when I read, I like to be able to read something in one go. So I'm in graduate school, so I read a lot, but mostly articles and book chapters and philosophical texts. And my habit is sitting down and reading one material at a time for um, from start to end. At least one sitting for every level of reading. You need to read the material several times, but at least for every moment of those repetitions, I want to be able to finish it in one go, as opposed to, say, setting aside just 30 minutes to read 5 pages, for example. I do that sometimes, but I find that to not be so effective. Actually, I wouldn't know. I'm not sure if it's more effective that I sit down and try to read the whole thing in one go, or if it's just me making excuses for why I I can't just read in this 5 minute interval, like 5 minutes, one page. But I'd rather look for a whole 3 hours before I say that, yeah, I'm gonna go and read. And so that's how I usually approach my reading, because I have this idea that I want to be able to be fully focused on the thing that I'm reading, and I want to be able to enjoy the process of reading such that there's a properly allocated time for it. That's partly because I'm I'm studying philosophy, and also partly because I like to write. So with this love for ideas, love for the written work, I would want that my practice for reading reflects that as well. However, the um, what happens instead is, because of this vision of a perfect reading setup, what ends up happening is I really don't get to read much for leisure, at least not as much as I want to. I think I'm quite lucky enough that I get to read more than a lot of the people in my cohort, for example. Um, but it's still not at the amount that I would feel pleased with, especially when I realize that I don't read a lot of fiction. Okay, scratch that. I didn't realize it. I know I don't read a lot of fiction. I've always enjoyed reading non-fiction works more, and I think the only time that I read a lot of fiction was when uh, Percy Jackson, the original Percy Jackson series, were being released, and I was reading through all of those things. And every time I'd go to the bookstore to look for the next book, sometimes I find other books as well, and I read those. But usually it's just Percy Jackson, maybe Hunger Games, some other stories, a few classics, Charles Dickens, and some other novels that are available as audiobooks, for example. But fiction books, as in fiction book for leisure or relaxation, that's not Percy Jackson or not the usual things that I'd read. I'm not as adventurous as compared to, say, fiction works. And that disinterest in fiction was highlighted as I had to read more nonfiction. Um, Now that I'm thinking about it, I remember there was like a year or two that I was reading so much fiction, but mainly because I wanted to be able to complete a particular number of books read in a year. So I think there were a couple of years that I read over 100 books, but that's because I read a bunch of fiction series, and because it's fiction, and because those are fiction books that I am not really interested in, not as much as other books, for example, I quickly went through them and didn't really develop um, that affection and appreciation for fiction. Strangely, I still wanted to write stories, but that's something that had been uh, bothering me for some time. That kind of contradiction between wanting to write stories and develop these worlds in my mind, but at the same time finding it difficult to find books, fiction books that I actually like or enjoy reading. I found that in the past 5 years of me trying to look for fiction books, I've always had qualms about the stories, the characters, and I, at some point, just thought that, yeah, I just I just don't enjoy fiction that much. I tried reading a bit more fiction um, that are significant to philosophy, but it I haven't yet at that time found something that could enthrall me and would make me want to read it out of just sheer desire to enter that world. And honestly, I thought that maybe it's just because maybe the stories aren't that good, the characters aren't that good, or it's just not something that I enjoy. But after being able to read this book, once again, I thought that maybe it's not completely the case. Because I love this series, I love this story. And I read all the books in the series, I read the other series by the writer, I watched the television series over and over again. I love the whole universe that was created here. And I was so excited to read it. But I just couldn't. And actually, when I was looking back at the time that I was reading the book that came before this, I was struggling a lot to finish reading it. That I just wanted to get through it as quickly as possible, just so it would be done already. And it wasn't a good feeling to read that way. It wasn't a good feeling to kind of rush through things. And at that time, the concern was, okay, I only have one day, and there's still a lot of things to be done. So I really can't dwell on this. Um, but what I did for this one is I waited until there was a sufficient time, a sufficient space actually, for this to come in and take the time and energy that it seeks as a book. And that time didn't come easy, which got me to thinking about how unfavorable that is. That it's just so hard to sit down and enjoy a piece of fiction. And a lot of what was stopping me from reading it was just thinking about how, okay, instead of this, I could just read something that I can use for, say, a research project, or I can go through a couple of articles first. I can reread this first. I can work on this first, work on that first. And it's so difficult to imagine just stopping for a day or two and accomplishing just reading one book, finishing just one book, especially if it's like it's a middle schooler's book. It's not classic. It's not a very literary, high literary fiction, but it's just a book for fun. So when I started reading it, I was already able to make some space for it, but the first half of the book was still kind of a struggle for me to truly enjoy. I mean, I enjoyed it. I love reading it. I love the story. It was so fun. But my in my own experience of me just sitting down and reading, I was a little antsy, kind of wondering if I should rush through this part or if I should take in every scene as carefully as I could. Um, but I continued. Somehow the time, the day was a good day to read the book. And eventually, as I got to the latter half of it, the last third, I can't recall now what happened in the scenes that really just struck me. But somehow, in the middle of me reading it, in the middle of just persisting in that process of going through these events in someone else's life, a story that's not really significant to mine, except for that sentimentality that had been developed over time, sentimentality that has no economic value, or even maybe not even philosophical value if I leave it as is. But as I went through that and just continued reading, eventually some scenes would come up and I would find myself naturally engaged with what was happening. I would feel a pleasant surprise sensation just filling my whole body, and some warmth, some hope, light, and delight, excitement, curiosity, even fear and anxiety would follow. My senses would follow with those emotions, with those feelings, as the characters were going through them. And at the end of the book, it was just a fun experience. It was just a really good book that made me realize how, in a way, the world is not simple, especially not here. It's a difficult life for this child, Percy Jackson. But in the end, it's a happy ending. It's a good ending, and all the value that is in it, all the work that comes with reading the book, is are those that remains within just my heart, and that's a great experience that I'm just so thankful for. At some point, I was thinking that the characters here, Percy, Annabeth, Grover, they've gone through so much in the previous series. They have gone through Tartarus and back, to hell and back, multiple life or death situations. And when the series of their senior year adventures came up, that somehow there was a thought that kind of the action kind of went uh, down a bit. It kind of simmered down to something more simpler. But I like that. It's this idea of kind of cruel idea if you think about it, that after this group had already sacrificed so much, they're still doing a bunch of these quests, and they're not free completely ever. And I don't know how to think about that on an ethical level, but it was a fun book to read. It was a good book to read, and it makes me want to understand or figure out how I can develop that ease and appreciation of fiction more. Not just fiction that are deep and literary and philosophical, but just fiction in general. In uh, Paul Ricoeur has this series of lectures on imagination, and in the collection of the book about it, there's a chapter there that where he explains the difference between fiction and fantasy. And fantasy or magical fantasy, something that can't recall the terms. But the main point there is fiction is quite something more than just made up stuff. It's important to our lives. It has a great philosophical value that I will not try to get into right now. But the point is, part of what makes it fiction is that somehow it has like two things. One is it's grounded on human life and human existence. In a way, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't made up, but it reflects something of the truth of human existence or ideas similar to that. And two is that it also has a life of its own. And I think it's nice to see how this series of Percy Jackson and the Olympians has shown that piece of a series, a set of stories that are easy reads, quite light to an extent. I don't think going through hell and back can be considered or should be considered light, or maybe it can. I don't know. But yeah, just seeing the progression and how it's not some complex world or some highly philosophical text. It's just a story about a boy, story about some kid's life. And that touched a lot of people, like me, like a lot of those who are well into their adulthood and are still looking forward to the next season of the TV series. And it has a life on it of its own that way, that it can extend to how many books now. It may not always be this completely intense action, this super existential or super worldly dilemma. But it's somehow some part of it in a way that for me my answer would be a little simply personal, that I enjoyed it, but in a way that has value